Okay, well everyone, thank you for joining us today for this webinar. We're going to talk about the principles of risk-based quality management today, and we're going to look at that through the eyes of clinical data management. So we have two presenters for you today, myself, and let me bring up the next slide for you here. Whilst I have the ball here, let me introduce myself. I'm Richard Davies, VP Solutions Expert at CluePoints, and I'm going to lead off the discussion today. But with me, I also have Tanya. Tanya, can I hand it to you, and perhaps you could introduce yourself for the audience?
Thanks very much, Rich. Super excited to be here today. So hi, everyone. Great to see so many names on the call today. We're addressing a really hot topic at the moment. So hopefully the insights that Rich and I share today will really enrich some of you, and you can take it back to your companies and start an exciting journey. So I'm currently VP Data Strategies and Solutions at Bioforum, the Data Masters. And yeah, this is something that I'm super excited about. I tend to get very excited about the nerdy topics like data management, but that's me in a nutshell. And luckily I have a friend in Rich who's equally excited about risk-based approach.
Thank you, Tanya. Yes, and judging by the attendees for today's call and the high number of registrants we've had for this, I think there's a lot of excitement, as you say, within the industry about this. So just an administration slide before we start. We're using GoToWebinar today, and over on the right hand side of your screens you should all see the panel where you can record questions if you have questions for us as the webinar progresses. So please do use that over on the right hand side. Send questions through. We are allocating some time at the end for some Q&A. And so hopefully we can get around to some of those questions as we go. So with that said, we're going to talk about risk-based quality management and data management today. And the presentation is basically divided into half. I'm going to lead us off talking about why clinical trials in general benefit from RBQM, and also why data management can benefit from an RBQM and a risk-based approach as well. And then I'm going to pass to Tanya, who's going to give you some more of her practical experience in this area in the second half of the presentation. So with that said, let's start by looking at a warning letter, which is only a couple of weeks old, actually. This was published by the FDA about 2-3 weeks ago now. And when I saw it, it actually made me pivot the start of this webinar and incorporate this, because I think it's a timely reminder that things don't always go as we want them to with our site investigations. Now you can go and find the letter through the FDA's website and go and look at it in its entirety, but I cherry-picked the center of the slide there, that middle paragraph, which I think sums up this particular situation nicely. So, as discussed, you failed to conduct the clinical studies because there were 2 studies that were impacted in this case in accordance with the investigational plan. Specifically, the majority of subjects randomized into the 2 protocols didn't receive sufficient dosing to support the primary objectives of the studies, which raises concerns about the validity and integrity of the data collected at your site. So, clearly not a great situation to be in. And when I read things like this, because I live in the RBQM world day in, day out, I always tend to kind of reverse engineer these scenarios when I see them and try and think about, well, how could RBQM have had a positive impact on this particular situation? How could it have prevented the situation occurring in the first place, or given us some ability to detect what's happening at site and, you know, get course correction in place so that this didn't blow up into the ultimate issue that it did blow up into? So, you know, reading the letter, there were 2 trials that were impacted by this particular situation. You know, the letter talks about the primary objectives of the studies were impacted, and so it makes me think about endpoint data being compromised. And it also obviously talks about dosing not being achieved in the way it should have been achieved. And I'm not saying that this happened in this situation, but when you think about dosing that doesn't happen as it should do, you start also to think about potential safety issues as well. And for me, and I think all of us on the call today, those are really issues that matter on clinical trials. That's what we're desperately trying to protect ourselves against and ensure that these kind of things don't impact the investigation work that we're conducting. So it also makes me think about what opportunities were there to prevent this situation occurring in the first place, and how could RBM have helped try and get us into a position where that could have happened. When you read through the letter, it's actually a response by the FDA to their own on-site audit of that site. So the issues that they're referring to are the issues that they detected when they went to go and see that particular investigator. And you can't tell from the letter how much the sponsor and the CRO knew about what was happening at the site, and where they were with dealing with that particular site. But in the worst case scenario, it could be a situation whereby this was detected by the regulator's audit and it had gone under the radar up until then. So, as I say, when I look at these kind of things, I think back to RBQM, and I think about the blueprint for executing RBQM, and I wonder where, in that particular situation, perhaps something could have happened that prevented the ultimate scenario that developed with that particular site. So, going through that letter and seeing that the primary objectives and potentially the endpoint data being impacted, for me, that always ties back to this concept of critical data and critical processes, which is right at the start of the RBQM journey. And so I ask myself, well, could a focus on critical data and processes have properly identified what our endpoint and safety related data was, so that we had the appropriate protections put in place to make sure that nothing tremendously bad happened as the trial progressed. And once you know what your crown jewels are and you understand that what your endpoints are and that dosing is perhaps a critical process associated with those endpoints, well, what risks are you at in terms of can dosing go wrong in some way or another? In this case, obviously, we've got proof that dosing could go wrong. So identification of that risk as part of the RBQM process could have led us to go off and evaluate that particular scenario and say, well, okay, it's unlikely perhaps that this kind of thing is going to happen at the site. But in terms of impact, if the dosing does go wrong at the site, we have a significant problem with the trial and it could really compromise the trial. So we've exposed a significant risk to the trial by going through this stepwise RBQM process, to the point where we should be able to define risk controls that are either preventative, or we can look at our internal resources within monitoring and within data management, and we can look at how they can be brought to bear to then keep an eye on the crown jewels and try and spot any early indication of something not going correct at the site. So I think RBQM has a huge importance in the way clinical trials are run today. And it doesn't just touch monitoring, site monitoring and central monitoring. It is applicable to data management and what happens in our data management environments as well. Now, if protecting against site issues wasn't a good reason to be doing this, you can also take the lens of the regulators into account as well. So over the last couple of years, we've had a couple of publications and ICH guidance that has really pushed this kind of approach to running clinical trials, starting with ICH E6R2, which straight out of the gate includes the word efficient within the language used in that document, using efficient approaches to clinical trial design and the subsequent execution of those trials in order to be very focused in terms of what we're doing. And then ICH E8 talks about, or it discourages, inflexible one-size-fits-all approaches to supporting quality of a given study. And in both of those documents, I think they give us really good pause for thought in terms of thinking about what we're doing within our own organizations and in data management in particular, and thinking about how efficient are we operating? Are we still perhaps implementing one-size-fits-all approaches from one trial to the next that aren't really honed to the perceived risk of those trials, and we're perhaps going through this rinse and repeat operation where we're just doing, what we're used to doing on the next trial because it seems to have worked in the past, and we'll continue to do it until we find it a good not to. As well as the regulatory lens, data management departments are also under pressure from the 5 Vs. So not all of you on the call today are seeing this in the same way, but I think as clinical trials evolve moving forward, you will start to experience additional pressure from, firstly, the variety of data that we're collecting in clinical trials today. So we're seeing more and more systems being responsible for collecting data, and those systems all have to be processed by us in data management. And I heard a figure, I think last week, someone was telling me about only about 30% of data which is collected on a clinical trial now goes through the EDC system, for instance. And so I'm sure many of you have seen other systems coming into play, other additional data sources, all that have to be dealt with and reconciled. And given your data management expertise to steer towards successful conclusion at the end of the trial. Now, many of those data sources can also capture much more data than we've been used to in the past as well. So if we think about wearables and devices and that kind of thing, they have the capacity to throw many more thousands of records in our direction than the traditional CRF site-based approach to collecting data from patients as they visit the clinical sites. And also, the velocity of that data can be higher as well. So data management can be faced with many more data sources, much more or much higher volume of data, and that data arriving much faster than it has done previously as well. And of course, as data managers, we are responsible for maintaining and ensuring the veracity of that data and ensuring that the value of that data is maintained to the clinical trials that are collecting it as well. So, this is something that I think we'll see more of as we start to do more decentralized clinical trials and capture more data directly from patients. We'll see more challenges in this area coming into data management. Interestingly, I also heard that there's also a direct connection between the number of data sources and ultimately how long it takes to perform database lock on a clinical trial as well. So if you're seeing increased number of data sources, don't be surprised if you're seeing your database lock time sliding a little bit as well. So risk-based approaches in clinical data management are timely, and there's some additional reasons on this slide why it's timely to think about what we're doing in data management and to see how aligned it is with a risk-based quality management approach. Firstly, I think it's quite common in some data management departments for the focus to be very task and cycle orientated. So we have the things to do on the data, and we have our frequency for performing those activities. And one measure of success is that we're getting through those activities at the appropriate cycles. And so we can put a tick in the box that we're adding value to the data just by going through those cycles and tasks. But there's an opportunity there, and that's to think about the outcome and to actually look at what value those tasks and cycles are actually bringing to the data. And perhaps that gives us an opportunity then to refocus or think about the balance between what we're doing and when we're doing it within data management. Now, if we look at some of the industry publications going back to 2014, of course, there was the work that we're all familiar with, I'm sure, in terms of looking at the changes that occurred on, I think it was just over 1,000 clinical trials. This was sponsored by Trancelerate members and published in the DIA journal, where the conclusion was only 3.7% of the data was ever changed in those clinical trials. And this particular work took aim at SDV, where it was shown that SDV was responsible for even less of the changes. And out of that, I think we took the first steps towards thinking about what really matters, and is what we're doing in terms of quality control really aligned with what matters on a clinical trial. And then more recently, there's been a very similar piece of work. So a number of organizations looked at their data and looked at, this time, how much data had been impacted by data management queries on the back end. And I saw Peter Stockman present this at an ACDM call a couple of weeks ago. Really interesting findings, very much aligned with the Trancelerate findings as well around SDV, in that only 1.7% of data was seen to being changed on the back of data management queries. And so again, it was another really good example of, really low return on investment, and perhaps another opportunity to pivot and focus on really eliminating errors that matter and detecting errors that matter within data. And there's a final one here from me, which is, although I talk to many organizations that are on the RBQM journey, often that has had a lot of focus around monitoring and central monitoring. And I still talk to data managers who will say that their organization is going down the RBQM route, but they kind of still feel the poor relation. And they still feel that in many situations, the trial is kind of thrown over the fence at them, and then they have to deal with it. And if they were more engaged with the RBQM process right from the start, they could become more influential and potentially help to design out some of the things that they then ultimately find themselves having to deal with as the trial then actually executes. I put a citation into Peter's paper there. It's published by the SCDM, and do go and have a look at that as additional insight into something which is particularly related to data management. Now, when we think about clinical data management, there are three words that often come up to really describe what data managers are responsible for. The first one is completeness of the data. We spend a lot of time in data management trying to ensure that all the data is collected. We have complete data sets, chasing down that data when we don't have everything that we anticipate we should do, either to go and collect it or to at least be able to query it and be told why we can't have that particular data so that we know why. Then there's the compliance of data. So data managers invest a huge amount of time implementing the rules laid out in the protocol and our own rules in terms of what hurdles does data have to jump over in order for us to find it acceptable and to be compliant in our eyes and to be good data. So obviously we do a lot of this around EDC and edit checks and dynamic CRFs and that kind of thing. And it's a big piece of our work. It consumes a good deal of time, a good deal of validation, testing and documentation, which is often where I hear data management departments claim they get bogged down in a lot of activity. And then there's consistency. So this is a broader topic. When we talk about consistency against what? Are we talking about data being consistent within a patient record or across patients at a site or across all sites in a trial or all of those situations? And so we can always start to look at consistency a little bit differently, and we will no doubt have different focuses in data management in the way in which we try and use data management practices to get consistent data recorded into our trials. I'm going to ask a poll question at this point. So I'd just like to get your thoughts in terms of, we have a selection of data management practices here. I'd like to see if you've got a preference in terms of which one of those data management activities do you think positively drives quality and integrity in the data that you collect on clinical trials. So we've got automated edit checks, we've EDC-based edit checks for data collection and dynamic CRFs. We've got manual review of data. We've got data reconciliation between different data sources. We've got perhaps a more patient-focused view of data, perhaps using patient profiles, and then more holistic reviews of data, perhaps taking a data set to look for problems within it, or specifically looking for patient-related issues or site-related issues in the data. So I know this is asking you to perhaps try and choose your favorite child, but can you all perhaps choose a result there? And I have no prior concept as to what might be the favorite, whether we will get a complete balance. So I think we've had the poll open, Gemma, now long enough. Could you flip to the results, please? Interesting, holistic review, which for me is the one that I would favor. Interesting that edit checks also come quite high. And that's understandable too, because trying to protect the quality of the data as it's collected is obviously a good thing. Now that also ties in with what I'm going to talk about next as well. So that's really good feedback. Appreciate you filling that poll question in. Let's take that away and move on to the example that I've got for you here. And this is predominantly edit check focused. So we're going to collect vital signs data on our clinical trial. The vital signs data only needs to be collected at visits 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I could imagine we'd set up our CRF, we'd have a leading question. Have you collected vital signs from a patient, yes or no? So if the site say no, it's visit 1, 2, 3, or 4, they would get an auto query to say that that's not right, and they should. And so they could then go, okay, yes, and then the screen would open up, they'd be able to enter the vital signs at that visit. Then we could fill it all in, but perhaps miss out systolic, and they'd save the page, and then we query them again and say, oh, that's not allowed to be empty, you need to fill that in. So they could then go and enter some data for systolic, and perhaps they put in 89, and they'd save again, and we'd say, no, that's not right either, because that's out of range. And they'd look at what they'd done, and they'd figure out they made a typo, and it should be 98, and they correct the data, save it, and we receive that data. So we get the data set in the table over on the left-hand side there, where that data is complete because we have records for all the patients at visits 1, 2, 3, and 4. And at those visits, we have the systolic results as well. So for completeness, it looks good. And for compliance, all those systolic variables are within our range. And so that seems to be good. But let's take that data and drop it into a visualization tool. And now you can see when we compare Site 1's data against the other sites within the trial, that although the data is complete, and although it's compliant with the checks that we put in place, we can see clearly, visually, that there's something different about the data collected at Site 1. And in actual fact, although it's complete and it's compliant, we have site issues in the data for Site 1. You can see across the other sites there's much more variability in the results, whilst the range of results for Site 1 is very, very narrow indeed. And all the data there actually fits the compliance rules that we had set, and it meets those entry and acceptance criteria that we had put in place. So, focusing on what matters. Did the site provide the vital signs results for all the visits? Well, yes, we did. So we get a tick. Did the site always provide the systolic results at the visits that they should have done? And yes, they did. So another tick. And then did those systolic values fall within the expected range? Yes, they did. So for our acceptance criteria, our entry criteria, the data is good. But clearly, there is something about the data of that site that is very, very different. And if we look to the right, there are some reasons there why the data might be the way it is. It might be that actually some of that data is fabricated in the worst case situation. In the worst case situation, maybe even the patients don't exist, but the patients could be real, and perhaps the data for systolic or for some of those visits, for whatever reason, has been fabricated by the site. There's always a potential that something went wrong at the site with the measurement of that data. So something procedural, a training issue, perhaps someone who wasn't really qualified to take the test with the patient was put in charge of it, and that has had an impact on the data that's been collected. And perhaps there's also a calibration issue with the blood pressure monitor. And perhaps there's several problems here that are compounding one another. Perhaps there is an issue with the blood pressure monitor, and it was a more junior person who was responsible for performing those tests, and their lack of experience meant that they didn't pick up the fact that there seemed to be a very narrow range of values coming from that blood pressure equipment as those measurements were taken. But I think you would say that the issues over on the right-hand side are really the things that matter, and the things that, if possible, we should be training ourselves towards focusing on those particular types of issue, because they impact so much more of the data and are so much more potentially problematic than just whether we've got data which is out of range or data that isn't SDV'd correctly, and those kind of more tactical issues. There's a real opportunity, I think, in many data management departments to focus and perhaps refocus on these wider site-based behavioural issues and seeing how they can use their skills to pick up on those as soon as possible, considering that in data management, we've got all the data and we've got very data-focused people within our organisations. There's a real opportunity to perhaps move the focus away from the completeness of compliance and start to think on these other types of issues that can be so much more impactful to the success of the trial. Now, detecting those kind of issues isn't always easy, and detecting those kind of issues as early as possible and as efficiently as possible is an even bigger challenge. Now, I've shown you one example there where with that numeric data, using visualizations was a really quick and simple way to spot the fact that we had something strange going on at one of our sites. But there are other approaches that we could bring to bear as well. So a different way that we could do this is through a more data-driven approach. And this is part of what CluePoints provides through our own solution, which is a data-driven approach to look for these really nuanced patterns within data that can be representative of these more impactful site issues. So I don't have time today to go through this in a whole heap of detail, but you can see there are 4 different categories of tests there that can be applied in a data-driven approach. So perhaps you are interested in knowing whether there is a higher or lower reporting rate of some kind of data within your clinical trial. So that's an example of one kind of data-driven approach. Moving down between patient variability, perhaps we want to know if there is less variability between patient systolic results, as we have just seen in data, and have that flagged to us. Perhaps it's looking at variability within the patient record, or sequence outliers, which are unusual spikes as the data transitions from one visit to the next. These are the kinds of things that a data-driven approach can surface to you, but surface to you efficiently. So with a data-driven approach, one of the things that we don't need to do is say what our expectations for the results would be. In a data-driven approach, we leverage the data against itself. So the results are the results based on the fact that a site, for instance, has a different pattern of data collected within it compared to all the other sites in the trial. And we haven't had to say what our thresholds, what our tolerances are. It is solely because the data is different that it gets flagged to us as something interesting that we should go and take a look at. And when we start to think about more data sources, higher volumes of data coming in quickly, and we think about data management and some of the pressures that we're under, having really efficient ways to go on and look for these issues that really matter in data is something I think which is going to become increasingly important over time. Now that's my last slide. So Tanya, I'm going to pass over to you now and let you bring in poll question number 2.
Thanks very much, Rich. So before we get into the thick of all the details, let's have a little questionnaire that everyone takes a look at. So where is RBQM positioned in your organization today? Have you had perhaps just a little bit of exposure, so you see this as a future state? Perhaps you're familiar with some of the concepts already, you've had discussions internally, but you haven't started implementing them really. Or maybe it's part of your current processes already. So you have buy-in, there's a focus within your company, and it's already, I want to say, built in there. And there may be some of you that are putting your hands up and saying, listen, RBQM is already a very integral part of how we run our trials. Just give another second or so. See still a few people voting. Okay, Gemma, you want to kill it there? Thank you. Okay, so that's interesting. We have a good diverse response here, which is kind of, I think, what I was expecting. So for RBQM to be part of your integral processes is really great. And I think there are definitely many companies out there that I want to say leading the way and leading the charge with this. But those of you that are kind of just on the first 2 lines, you know about it, it's in your plans, but you're still kind of yet to implement a lot of things, you can see you're definitely not alone alone. And then for those of you that have already got the buy-in and the focus, what an exciting time, right? You're already moving on and starting to plan these things. So perhaps that's why you're attending today. I think especially if you're in the first 3 lines, to kind of get an idea on where to start, especially on the data side of things. So with that, perhaps we can jump back to the slides, Rich. Great. Thanks. So before we get into the details around any of these things, I think we need to just take a minute to breathe. When I speak to customers often from our end, they'll say, listen, I understand the reason for doing this. If the ROI or the lack of ROI and the financial implications aren't enough, we've got the regulators breathing on our neck. They're actually leading the charge in this. So we're all in. We know we need to do this, but we're not 100% certain how to get started with this. And, at the end of the day, after all the effort from the clinical team, from even our effort on the data management and programming side, all that's left is the data. So people get very nervous because this is the end product of what we're doing, right? So you start talking about not completing processes or not fully looking at things, and it causes a level of anxiety. So companies will often say to us, but what do we stop? Where do we stop? If I think about stopping, I'm getting anxious just thinking about any data set, because all we want is the data to be 100% for our evaluations. But before you get into all that detail, which can definitely be a bit overwhelming, stop to think about there are really 3 areas and 3 principles that we're applying when we're looking at this. First of all, quality by design. So along with all of the publications about or releases now on regulations with regulatory authorities asking us to please stop blanket cleaning and start taking a more focused approach, there are also a lot of discussions around quality by design. And there are a number of reasons for that. So Rich earlier mentioned the 5 V's. We're looking at the veracity of the data and those kind of things as well. Data is changing and the meaning of that. So if we're thinking about things like synthetic arms, that means that the data you're using today could potentially influence future trials, and not just in terms of decision making, but actually be part of those trials. So it changes what our data means. So quality by design is just as a heavy, I want to say, influencer is what our change in ROI and our approaches should be. So hence it being at the top. Secondly, we do have critical data and we do have critical processes, and we need to protect those. Nowhere in any of the publications or releases are regulators for a single minute telling us to stop focusing on critical data. In fact, they're encouraging that. And then lastly, they say to us, take a risk-based approach. So when we're looking at our data, we need to kind of put these 3 together and say, focusing on the quality of our design, then looking at our critical processes, and then taking a step back and saying, okay, now let's embrace a risk-based approach kind of for the rest of the data. So getting into this, on the next slide, you'll see speaking a little bit about a process. So I want to walk you through the process of how you would start identifying your data and how you would go about looking at this approach. We'll go through more steps through the presentation, but I thought I would start here. I also would like to kind of challenge the wording of saying a risk-based approach to cleaning. I think that makes everybody nervous. As somebody myself that has been in data management for many, many years, when someone says, I'm not going to clean everything or I'm going to ignore something, it kind of creates like it kind of takes my breath away a little bit, like, wait, what do you mean with that? So I want to say, let's not call it risk-based approach, let's call it targeted review. And that kind of makes me feel better, and I'll bring that in as well, so you can understand when I'm saying a targeted review of data. So we're not saying we're not looking at things or we're going to push anything aside. We're saying let's target our focus on certain areas, and then let's look at other data in a different way. So starting at the very beginning is looking at your critical data points. So look at your study, look at what they are, what data points there are, and identify those critical data points. So those of you that have been around for as long as I will remember back in the paper days, for most of the trials, we started like that. We created our CRFs, we designed them, and we had a discussion with our statistical teams where we asked them, which are the critical data points that you would like us to clean very thoroughly? So if you were in that process in the past, think back to that. We're kind of saying that's what we were asking you to do. Go back, think about your critical data points, list them out. And yes, you do need to have a discussion with your statistician around this. By all means, give a go yourself, jot it down, but this really does become a combined process in working with the biostatistics department within your companies. Then you need to take another step and take a look if there are any protocol-specific elements that need to be monitored and assigned to specific roles. So Rich mentioned earlier, things do go a little bit astray, and often we can't or don't plan for those because we didn't know they were coming. But sometimes we do know that there's a risky area. We know there's a specific assessment. We know it might be a grading scale. We know that it may be something that, typically this is not always completed correctly, or we do have issues with the measurements around these. So write those down, create a good list of areas that wow, this is kind of protocol specific, but we know this is going to be a bit crazy anyway, and write those areas down. Then think about your non-critical data. So all the data that's left after you've done your analysis on what's critical, and think about what data just needs to kind of be checked up on and what data needs to be triggered by a certain risk. So that would be, for example, if you're thinking about lab data could be triggered by a specific percentage of data going above or below the expected norms for that value. That would be a trigger. Or perhaps you could say, we're just going to keep an eye on this data. So it's not something that we're going to tentatively create additional checks on, but it's a good idea for us just to kind of take a look at it every now and again, make sure it's more or less aligned. And that could be something, for example, a patient's weight, for example. It might not be critical to any analysis, but you don't want that going up or down really. You would prefer it to stay constant or not significantly anyway. So that might be a data point that you just kind of want to put under the surveillance bucket. We need to look at it, but we're not going to do anything with it. Once you have those kind of defined out, you can start thinking about your key risk indicators, your KRIs. If you're already using an RBQM process within your company, so you're already using this for the clinical approach to your data, I would strongly encourage adding this step to that normal process that you have. So don't try and reinvent the wheel and start all over again. You're just going to add another agenda point to that meeting that you already have and have the discussion really focused on the data side of things. It's really great. You would probably be able to cover a lot of these aspects if you're looking at your protocol, for example. You are going to identify a lot of the issues there already anyway from a clinical perspective. So just take that next level up on the data. So we're going to have an issue obtaining this data clinically, and that means we're going to have an issue with the data itself. That's kind of the mindset you want to go in. If you're not completely doing this within your company just yet, or you're approaching it that way, think about combining the process, or alternatively, if you're starting from scratch completely, you do need to think about having a good discussion around these KRIs. So it's critically important. This is not a one department discussion. This is a discussion where you need to bring a number of people in. So you need to have your clinical team there. You need to have your statistician, who really becomes key to this entire discussion, right by your side as you're having these discussions. And then additionally, you need to really think about who else you need to have there. So medical monitors, for example, you really need to have around the table as well, just to have the clinical aspect or the medical aspect around some of the data. And then lastly, you want to think about your mitigations and your risks. So once you have your KRIs, what are you going to do with these? So when it happens and you have this thing that pops up, what are you going to do with it? What is the action that you're going to take with that specific risk? Are you going to take a more thorough review? Are you perhaps going to initiate a review by a specialized role? What are you going to do when that happens? So going back to my example of the lab data, once you have this parameter that has now been triggered, it's gone over a certain percentage above the specific range, what are you going to do with that? You need to define that out, and you would need to do that for each of your KRIs. As I mentioned, if you have this already in place from the clinical perspective, you can continue with that. When you stop and you think about all of this, you're going to kind of get back to the point where you're thinking about your data check. So right, Tanya, we have now identified our critical points. We know what data we're going to clean thoroughly, what data we're going to survey, what we're going to look at from a risk aspect. How do we get started? I just want to remind everybody, as I said from the beginning, that quality by design is very important. So yes, you're going to start looking at your edit checks, but right from the beginning, you want to look at the little diagram on my slide here, the top 2 quadrants, and that's going to contribute towards your quality by design. We do not want to get rid of those checks. We don't want to get rid of our approach to that. getting the data in of a high quality is just as important as getting the data out. So we want to continue doing that. So ensuring the data is coming in. These are your conformant data checks, the way you design your database. These kind of things need to really be there as well. Then when you look at the second part of the diagram, we're talking about incomplete or missing data or data consistency and validity. And now things getting a little bit murky there. We're starting to think about, okay, some of this data will be for quality and we want to keep that, but the others are leaning more towards data cleaning now. So this is us taking our approach and trying to bring all the data points together. So we need to start by saying, let's take a look at those edit checks properly. And I think you'll be really surprised by the data that you get out of there. How many of them actually fire? How many of them can be combined? And are they really necessary? So an example of both of those are, is the check really necessary? We had a discussion, we had a thorough reconciliation between two databases, the typical that you would have for labs. So we were comparing patients' dates of sampling in the CRF or the EDC database, as well as that on the outside, our external data. And at the end of the day, the statistician said to us, but look, we're really overriding that data. We're just taking the lab data because we don't need to have too much of it. It's supportive data. It's not key to analysis. So the question was, did we really need to do all of that if that data was going to be supportive? And then secondly, thinking about checks that don't fire, and you'll be surprised to see how many don't actually yield the high error rate that we expect them to. So thinking about those checks then, how many would you think of perhaps looking in a different way? So a typical example I always use is an age check. So for many studies, I think many companies have the check where we say, is this patient within the correct age range? But the question is, how many times does that fire? Thinking back to the fact that we actually put conformant checks in our database to say that a site cannot actually enter a data below a certain date or above a certain date. So that check really fires. So perhaps it's better to look at it in a scatter plot, for example. Then thinking about your critical data, and I've put this as bullet number 2 on the slide, but really it shouldn't be bullet number 2. This should be bullet equally to bullet number 1 there. But think about your critical data and that discussion you've had with biostats. What is the path going to be for that cleaning? How are you going to look at that data specifically? And what do you need? And as I mentioned before, my example of the non-CRF data, we're seeing this as important data, but how important? How is it going to be linked? And is it actually critical? So jumping on to the next slide, thanks there, Rich. I just want everyone to take a deep breath at this moment, because at this point, most people start feeling a little bit overwhelmed and they're like, wow, Tanya, that's a lot of information. I need to go back and take a look at all of my edit checks, the way I'm building my data. And now I have to change the way I'm thinking. I need to take a targeted review and I need to kind of scratch everything and start again. And that's where I want to say, you can take a breath. We've actually been doing a lot of targeted reviews and data management for many years already. So we've kind of been preparing ourselves for this moment where we just take it to the next step. So if you think about the way we prepare our data and how we work with it, we're already doing this, right? So when we think of our CRF designs, we're doing smart designs. We're thinking of the structure of fields. We're using radio buttons when we don't want to allow a site to have more than one option. We're using checkboxes when we want them to potentially have more than one option. We're already thinking smartly about how we're getting that data in. And our edit checks are exactly that. It's a targeted focus at our data. So somebody is sitting with a protocol and with the database, so your CRF, and they're saying, right, what data should I be checking within this database? And that already is the correct mindset of saying, what are we going to look at? And if you think about your manual reviews, we're saying, what else do we need to look at that cannot be catered for in our database? So mentally, I think we're already in the right process of thinking about our data the right way. We just need to kind of release the reins a little bit and say, okay, let's think a little bit differently about how we're collecting that data and what we're going to do with it. So next, we'll speak a little bit about the plan of action. You've gone through these reviews, you're thinking about what to do. So what do you do within your organization now? How do you actually get this ball rolling, and how do you get the momentum to stay within your company? And I think for many of you, you've realized there's a significant mind shift change here. So in the past, and I think this has been coming for many years already, but this is just another nudge in that direction, we no longer work in silos. Data management is not a department on its own. Clinical is no longer a department on its own. The stats is no longer a department on its own. When we're taking this type of a risk-based approach, we really need to merge and we need to work as one unit with different focuses. Of course, that will always remain, but we need to have this mind shift change. So within a company, there needs to be these levels of discussion saying, hey, we need to think about how we're doing this, what meetings are we holding, and how are we actually approaching this. And that mind shift change is not just for data management, it's for the whole organization. A statistician who typically may have been involved in the study in the beginning, hopefully they were reviewing the CRF and checking edit checks, now needs to really sit at the table and play a very key role in determining these KRIs around data risk-based approach. And they need to understand how important their role is and where they're going. So it's critically important to help that mind shift change happen. And I've spoken about the combination of efforts now, but we need to think then holistically, do we need to upskill our teams? And this can happen in different ways. So we'll talk a little bit about, what else we can do there. But in addition to that, changing the processes. And I would really encourage companies here to take it process by process. There's a temptation here because this is such a big change that companies sometimes want to say, right, we're going to rip off the plaster, so to speak, and we're just going to go straight in and we're going to jump in and take all our processes and revamp them all at once. If it's not clear already, you can imagine how overwhelming that would be for any team to kind of have to throw all their comforts away and really jump into it. So I would say do this systematically. Don't jump in and rip plasters off. Just go through each process, think about each of them, and then as you're doing your testing, think about how you're going to do those processes and really take hands with a company that has done this before. So many of our customers, we're leading them through this process, we're helping them through it, we're guiding them as they go along. It's sometimes impossible to have all of these different mindsets and these different talents within your own company, and you may need to look for them outside, but that may not be a big mistake. It might be enhancing what you need to do because you just need that expert that you can check into and say, hey, can I have a quick conversation? So reviewing your methodologies and your tools really links back to having that important foundation to get started on. So what do you need when you're going to get started? You have your plan now, you know that you're going to move on, you know that you're going to change the mindset within your team. What do you need in order to get this going? So from the very beginning, you need a good analytics tool. This is very important. We're looking at data differently. So much to Rich's examples in the beginning, yes, we are going to maintain some of our checks. Yes, we are going to continue looking at some of our critical data in the same way we have in the past. But we now need to think about our data differently. So that age check, as I was using it as example, well, it's pretty important. We can't have people outside the age range that's happening there, but perhaps just having a scatter plot or at least the potential to do a quick scatter plot is something that really could save a lot of time rather than programming a check, validating the check, and then just having no return on all of that effort that went into it. So a good analytics tool, a good versatile analytics tool that can support you in different areas of the data that you want to look at. So looking at data from a site perspective, like Rich was showing, where you could clearly see that there was a difference between the data in one site compared to the others. But looking at data on a patient level as well, where you can see information for a specific patient. And then looking at data on a data set level. So many of you clicked that holistic review, which made me super excited because that is, I think, where many companies and where we definitely see the most value being added to the quality of the data. When you take a step back and you look at a data set holistically, a lot more tends to jump out at you. And having a good analytics tool really is going to help you guide in that process. So many of you may be using SAS, but this is kind of taking it to the next level. Or if you have a SAS environment, thinking about taking that environment to the next level, but really having tools that can kind of be flexible enough to bring you these insights to your data. And I mentioned earlier, thinking about your team and the upskilling of that team. So you may need to think about trainings, things that you can present to your team, training that you can provide them in order to really get them onto the next level to be able to take this next approach at data, but you may need to think about hiring externally as well. So again, from our reference, this is where many of our customers reach out to us and say, hey, we're not even sure where we need to start or what team members we need here. Can you help us out? And it's about having those right people there. So you may not have somebody who is so comfortable with data analytics, for example, at this point. So yes, you may have a great tool, but you may not be able to get the most out of that tool because you're not 100% certain on how to use it. And that is where you have partners such as CluePoints that can help you with that as well. So really having a good analytics tool that's there, supporting those skills and having the right team to do it. And then start thinking a little bit about how you're going to test this. And immediately, for most people, when I speak to them, they start thinking about pilots, which is great. But you need to think about how you're going to test that before you get to your pilot stage. Sometimes it's great to use old data, and you can use that and you can kind of go through the phases. Like as you had data snaps throughout your trial, you can use the data and you can test your checks and you can use it as a test study. And often it's a good idea to run a test trial, you know, as you're doing your pilot, run it in parallel with the current study, just to see what the output is going to be. And that would be the best way to check the efficiency and the effectivity of those checks that you kind of have in your analytics tool. And then lastly, I quickly just wanted to mention that, you know, there's a real variety of approaches currently at the moment, and people are taking a different look at it. So in terms of industry adoption, we have got a nice array at the moment of companies. So we have those taking a conservative approach. They are starting with data surveillance. So they're not kind of jumping in and saying, right, we're only going to be looking at data with the KRIs now. We're only looking at critical data. The rest we're just going to kind of look up. They're saying, let's start and look at the top of the data surveillance first. Then we have those that are already testing. They have the analytics. They're already getting into things and they're testing it. And then we have those that are starting to accept. So if you look around you, at your colleagues, your friends on LinkedIn, you'll see a variety of different companies taking different approaches here. And some of them are already in that pilot phase and have accepted the whole process to getting started. So start looking around, speak to your friends, speak to companies that have already got into this, speak to vendors that can help you and really get into it. There's a good variety of adoption. So just in closing out, kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, so what's the potential outcome? Why would you do this? Why would you invest in all of this? As I mentioned, you've got a little bit of homework to do in terms of your checks. So thinking about your cleaning strategy. So would it lead to a higher quality and integrity of your data? Yes, absolutely. So the opportunity to target data with an alternative approach. So it's improving actually the way that we're doing our data cleaning. It's focusing on areas that really matter as opposed to blanket cleaning across all data just to check a box and say we did it. And would it leverage the maximum of value from the available resources? Absolutely. So all of those redundant and low return activities that we've been doing kind of get pushed aside, and we take a much more sophisticated approach and focus our attention to those target dated areas that really need our attention for the analysis. Would it shorten timelines? Of course. Again, removing those redundant checks is going to save a huge amount of times. And then the last question is, would it generate some financial savings? So with that, Rich, let's talk a little bit about that. I'm looking at a number on the slide here, which seems rather large. Do you want to share some insights around where this number comes from?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a poll question for you. We won't get to that in the interest of time now, but just in terms of financial savings, this number comes from a clinical trial where a site continued to operate after the point in which issues were detected within the data. If you want to fill in the poll question, Gemma just flipped it up there for you. It was a little bit tongue-in-cheek in terms of if 351,100 is the answer, what was the question? And the answers there are, will that buy you a new Ferrari? Is it how much Gemma spends annually on chocolate? I will just say that she suggested that answer. That hasn't come from me. And the final choice there is how much money was wasted on a clinical site with issues. So feel free if you want to vote there. But in the interest of time, I've given you the answer. It's obviously to do with that site. What happened with this is that we wound the clock back with the data. And we were able to detect the issue that this site experienced the site was only excluded after the end of the trial when the initial issue was detected. Winding the clock back, we were able to show that it was possible to detect that issue at about 20% data accrual in the trial, and that was about month 8. So a little bit of maths to work out from month 8 through to the end of the trial, how many patient visits were there, how many monitoring visits were there, how much data management and admin costs were there. That all totals up to the $351,000 that you see there. So a real world example of where money can be saved through taking this approach, and lives could be made a lot easier on a trial by early identification of these kind of issues, where you can nip them in the bud quickly rather than them becoming the ultimate issues that they are. Andrea, can I open it out to you? I know we have run over. We are recording this, so if some people have to drop, then they can always pick up on the Q&A on the recording. Let me just see if we have any questions that we could take very quickly before we close off today.
Sure, Rich. Thank you very much. And Tanya and Rich, fantastic presentation. And I can tell by the flurry of questions we received that you've definitely piqued the interest of the attendees. In the matter of time, why don't we just take one question for you, Rich, and one question for Tanya, and then we'll close out. The questions we did not get to online today, we will definitely be following up. We'll make that a priority with our speakers, so you'll hear from us shortly. So Rich, since you went first, the first earlier question we got was, do the alternative approaches you mentioned only provide insight into site-related issues?
Oh yeah, good question. No, not just site-related issues. And when you think about doing this on different types of trials, obviously there are smaller trials where you have hardly any sites, perhaps even single site trials, etc. So the data-driven approaches can be applied to tease out site operational issues, but also to tease out issues by looking from one patient across all the other patients. So you can work at the patient level, and you could even extend out to look at regions and countries and that kind of thing as well. So yeah, it's possible to apply those different techniques at different levels. On your big phase 3 multi-center trials, you might be looking at country issues and site issues and patient issues. On a small phase 1, first in man, you might be just drilling down and looking at patient-related issues and trying to detect those using a data-driven approach. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question there.
Perfect. Thank you, Rich. And Tanya, hopefully this question is not too big for a couple of minutes, but we were posed, what has been the biggest challenge in your experience that companies have had getting started with this approach?
Thank you, Andrea. Yes, I anticipated that question a little bit because I think everybody feels that anxiety from the very beginning. And I really have to say it's as simple as mindset. It's difficult to get people to change the way that they have been doing things for many, many years. And we have to remember that, these processes have been embedded in our companies for very, very, very long. So it's decades of approach to data that we're kind of saying we need you to kind of loosen those reins a little bit and think of doing things differently. But honestly, in our experience in helping many companies with this, once that light bulb goes on, and often it's linked back to people just understanding what the value is in that. So once they see, wow, this has actually got great benefits for me, specifically within the biostats team, for example, immediately they're more engaged in that. So I would just encourage companies there, if they're thinking about doing this and you're taking your leap, you need to get that mindset change and the buy-in there with all of your team members. So focus a lot on how this is going to be advantageous for them as well. And you'll really see that mindset change. Thanks, Andrea.
Great. Thank you both. And thank you to all of our attendees who have stayed over with us 5 minutes. Rich has shown here that if you have any further questions that you didn't get to type in, you can always contact us at contact@CluePoints.com, and we will also be following up on the questions we were not able to get to. So thank you, Rich. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you,
Thanks,
and
everyone.
thank you, everybody.